Yes.
Awesome. Okay.
So I'm just waiting for this to go live on YouTube real. Just 1 sec. It should be. All right, there we are. So I'm just waiting for this to go live on YouTube real. Just 1 sec. It should be. All right, there we are.
All right. So we are,
It should be.
are we good, Ken?
We are. I'm sorry. There's a little bit of feedback on my end.
There was a little bit of
Right.
Okay. All right. So we now convene the meeting of the task force to analyze and make recommendations on issues related to early childhood workforce development needs. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your time and your commitment to the field of early childhood education, and we're really excited to finally get this task force off the ground. I'm Jessica Powell. I am one of the co-chairs along with Dr. Marcia Bryant. And the purpose of today's meeting is really just to establish what the task force is about, what our aims are, and to figure out a work plan so we can accomplish our goals between now and January. Marcia and I will begin by just restating the language that was articulated in the original bill for what this task force should achieve. And then we'll take some time for introductions, and then we'll have Stephen Hegedus and Paige Bray maybe talk a little bit about how this task force came to be, and we can have a discussion about how to move forward. So, Ken, are you able to share the slide with what the task force should analyze?
Sure, no problem. I'll do that right now.
Awesome, thank you. Great. So if you could just go to the second slide. Okay, so there's 4 broad categories of what the task force is asked to examine. The first one is equity-based practices in early childhood teacher prep and professional development. So both pre-service and in-service models. The second is ways to address inequity in access to employment opportunities and compensation in the early childhood workforce. The third is exploring the feasibility of a new co-authored license that would offer multiple levels and flexibility and pathways into the field of early childhood. And the last is workforce demands in early childhood for birth through age 8. And Marcia is going to just talk for a moment about the recommendations that the task force should be making upon its completion. Marcia, are you able to do you have audio?
But I cannot see, I can't see the slides.
Oh.
So if you could see them, do you mind reading them for me?
Sure.
Because I can't see the slides.
Okay, sure. So the task force will make recommendations concerning legislation for educator preparation requirements, the creation of a new teacher license, the development of a framework for educator preparation, methods to increase compensation, and workforce development and creation of job opportunities. So we could take down the slides now, Ken. And so we're going to circle back to those in a few minutes, but we just wanted to put that language back out there. We will send out this language again in writing to the whole task force so we all have it. But we do want to take a moment just to pause and do introductions. Many of us are in the room for the first time together, meeting each other. So we'll just go around and introduce who you are and your position, and then we'll move forward. So I'm Jessica Powell. I'm an associate professor of education at Southern Connecticut State University in the Department of Curriculum and Learning. And I work in the early childhood, elementary, and our graduate equity and justice programs. Dr. Marcia Bryant, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Marcia Bryant, and I'm co-chairing the committee with Jessica, and I work downtown in Capitol.
And folks can just unmute and introduce themselves when they're ready.
Good morning. I'm Beth Bynum, Commissioner at the Office of Early Childhood.
Good morning. My name is Jenny Shea. I am here at CREC, and I'm the Director of Early Childhood Programs and Services.
Good morning. My name is Karen Lott. I'm the Executive Director of the Women's League Child Development Center in Hartford.
Good morning. My name is Kimberly Ploska, and I work for the Office of Early Childhood. I am the Division Director for Early Care and Education.
Good morning. I'm Paquita German-Smith. I'm a consultant at the State Education Resource Center in Early Childhood Education.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Hegedus. I'm the Dean of the College of Education at Southern Connecticut State University and work closely with Dr. Paige Bray in helping get us to where we are today and hopefully where we're going to head in the future. So I just want to send a personal thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Paige Bray. I wear a couple of hats. I'm an advocate for children and families first. That's my favorite and best and long enduring job. I'm also associate professor of early childhood at the University of Hartford, director of those programs, as well as the Center for Montessori Studies. This work I'm so excited to be here today, despite some other life things happening. This is a really awesome moment, and it's come partly out of a long-standing, way before my time in Connecticut, connection between the Early Childhood Higher Ed Consortium, which is all the 2- and 4-year faculty members working in early childhood together on behalf of the field and with practitioners. And then, as Stephen referenced, the Connecticut Consortium for the Advancement of Early Childhood Education, which is which was initiative of a grant. And I'll get to say, I think, a little bit more about that later when it feels important, but mostly just so glad to be shoulder to shoulder with everyone on this task force today.
Hi, I'm Deb Adams, Office of Early Childhood, just here to be helpful with data needs.
I'm Maggie Adair, Director of Government and Community Relations at the Office of Early Childhood, staff to the Commissioner.
I am Georgia Goldburn. I'm the Director of Hope Child Development Center, which is a center that serves children 6 weeks through age 13 in New Haven. I'm also the co-founder of Circle, which is a network of childcare providers of color in the greater New Haven area. We do serve some folks in Stamford and the Fairfield area because of our affiliation with the Staff Family Childcare Network. Really very interested in being a part of this conversation, especially given the work that we have been doing around apprenticeship and creating alternative pathways. We have been doing this work for about 7 years in New Haven, identifying folks who are interested in working in early childhood education and creating an alternative pathway for them to enter into the field. We're excited to also be a part of that workforce pilot because we also envision partnering with the New Haven Public Schools to create a pipeline there and a partnership there where we can identify young people who are interested in this field and getting them ready. So we are very early in that talks, but we are excited with the work that we're doing around the workforce.
Hi, hi, good morning. My name is Brian Klimkowitz. I'm calling in by phone today. I apologize for not being on camera. I'm the Special Education Division Director at the State Department of Education and very excited and honored to support this work.
Is that everybody? Great. Okay, so we're gonna turn to Paige and Stephen to talk a little bit about how this task force came to be, and they offer them an opportunity to share a little bit about their vision.
I think I'm going to start with a few nuts and bolts just because, and again, we'll be succinct. There's some supporting documents that we can submit if we wind up with shared spaces in that way. But this process actually began in the beginning of 2020, before the other beginnings of other things happening. The Early Ed Investment Collaborative put forth a national call for funding to have states and systems work invest, and Stephen and I connected with that entire group that became the consortium, which is higher ed practitioners, to really think about how can we shift the structures, because all of us in early childhood preparation know that there's private and public settings. There's huge pay differentials, which has been a through line of this work, the equity-based work, the access work. And so we proposed that we spend a couple of years taking a look at our landscape when it seemed like we had a couple of years always to do things back then. And that the outcome of that would be a final 6 months of a legislative process. We were finalists in that work, but we were not actually funded in the end. And so when that happened, the sort of proposal wound up being flipped, and the legislative work wound up coming first. So that's the sort of quick journey of how we got to this legislative piece. Obviously, then there was an amazing interactive and vibrant legislative process to get the task force here, which had maybe we not had a pandemic, we would have had about 18 months, hopefully, maybe 2 years. But we have 4 good months to work with now. Key things from the grant was, again, really looking at systems changes that benefited people coming into the early childhood field. So including compensation, including like stackables or ways that you can progress in the profession, but also making sure that the pieces fit together for the very diverse field of early childhood, right? We all know early childhood is not just school or school-based programs. And so that was really the legwork, and Stephen can speak to this as well, but building off of the relationships of higher ed faculty, of practitioners who are in the field, and those of us who are trying to prepare them for an ever-changing field, really started the work between Commissioner Bai and then Commissioner Cardona from the State Department of Ed to really look at the licensures that are in place. part of the groundwork for this is the early childhood teaching credential, which is a credential out of the Office of Early Childhood, which Deb Adams and other people can speak to more extensively. But it's an important aspect of credentialing in early childhood, but it sits in a different space than the State Department of Ed certifications. There is all sorts of complicating and enriching factors about compensation and qualifications. What's been exciting in the last couple years is we've seen a ton of national work around leveling, around the profession, from NACCE, as well as from the Council of Exceptional Children. And of course, all of that also wraps into our early birth to 3 and early intervention work. So nationally, the landscape is super exciting from my perspective. So the wait maybe has been timely for us, but the origins of this was, as always, a band of concerned citizens coming together to try to see how we can make system changes that better serve our field and our communities. That's my easy version of it. Again, happy to submit some documents with other materials, and want to make sure that Stephen, please add to whatever nuances I didn't or policies I didn't mention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bray. Thank you, Dr. Powell and Dr. Bryant, for co-chairing this really important meeting. I just want to start off by saying I'm not an early childhood expert. I'm a mathematician and math educator, and so Jessica can pull me from this call at any time if I'm saying stuff that's not relevant, but my main goal here is to help. I've seen in my career very similar issues that we are addressing today in the teaching and learning of mathematics, and the achievement gaps and the inequities that we have in a wide variety of settings in the classroom and beyond. I think the only thing I really want to add is the reason why we're here is probably because Paige and I are troublemakers, and that's often why these important task forces are established. But in all seriousness, when I got a call from the Board of Regents and the system office, at the time it was Provost Jane Gates, to reach out and team up and apply for this grant, what happened over the course of about 4 or 5 weeks was this, for me, this really empowering surgence of collaboration across publics and privates, colleges, universities, centers, but most importantly, our 2 agencies that intersect in this space. And I want to personally thank Commissioner Bai, who responded and picked up the phone and talked to us straight away and wrote letters in support of our approach. And also, as Paige mentioned, Commissioner Cardona at the time, who did the same. And it was a super encouraging response to have 2 commissioners join hands and support the grant that we were putting forward. But what was clear to us and clear to me as an outsider coming in to the world of early childhood education is that there are a lot of things in Connecticut that needed to be fixed. And so we needed eventually support from our elected officials. And so when the monies didn't come through, we reached out directly to Senator McCrory and Representative Bobby Sanchez, co-chairs of the Education Committee, and said we really need to get to that point where we're carefully examining how we license early childhood educators, and how they are compensated and how they're progressing the profession. And not that we're going to cover everything in this task force, but we certainly, we need to put forward goals, recommendations, policy changes to the regulations for teacher preparation, which as president also of the American Association for Colleges of Teacher Ed in Connecticut, we have been pretty consistent over the years in reaching out to our elected officials and the State Department of Ed and the commissioners in saying they're out of date and need to be addressed. I mean, some of these regulations are older than some of my students here at Southern. So it's time for change. And that's my personal investment in this, is to listen to you, to work with you, and to continue to be troublemakers up in Hartford to ensure that there is change that is for the good. So thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here. And I hope that sort of gives a quick intro to why we're here as well, Paige. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I want to make sure to acknowledge one other person that you didn't connect, that between the two of us we haven't, which is I really want to make sure to name Ingrid Kennedy and be so grateful that Paquita is here, because the grant had a core piece of equity and inclusivity, both, which is of course Cirque's strong house, and we're so grateful that they are on this task force and that we can all have part of that work, be part of the work, a thread through of the work. And lastly, I would just say I have great trust and faith in the legislative process when I see all the faces on this Zoom, because there's a lot of good trouble on this task force. So.
Thank you, Paige and Stephen. So given the short time we have to do the work, to end with some policy recommendations in January, Dr. Marcia Bryant and I were thinking about dividing into subcommittee work around the broad themes of the task force. And so we mentioned that in an email to y'all, but we want to discuss that today, name what those 3 subcommittees might be, and invite y'all to think about where you might land, where you might want to share your voice. And so, Ken, there's a slide with 3 subcommittees. If we could share that. So some of you already reached out and said where you might be interested. And a number of us still need to identify where we want to do the work. And so just to name a little more clearly, when we gather monthly, and I'll review before we end our monthly meetings, but when we gather monthly, those are going to be opportunities for us to hear from guest speakers who can help us get some perspective on where we should be moving. And then the work is really going to be happening in between these large task force meetings where subcommittees will meet and do some of the work that will then be reported out later in the fall. And hopefully these 3 pieces will be woven together into some policy recommendations. So based on the language from the task force, we were thinking these 3 broad subcommittees with an equity lens in all 3, with also thinking about compensation within these, particularly the first one and the third one there. So these are the three subcommittees that we were envisioning, and just want to invite folks to think about if there's something missing, if you want to throw your name in the chat and say, this is where I want to land. And so we also need a chair for the first subcommittee, where that will kind of gather some data and help us understand the landscape of the challenges, in early childhood education, both nationally and locally. So I just want to open it up to my co-chair, Dr. Marcia Bryant, or Paige or Stephen, and the whole task force for comments and reflections. Georgia.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm interested in definitely being a part of the equity conversation. So if that is, if we land on these 3 subcommittees, that's where I would like to lend my voice. I'm really concerned, though, that we are not speaking very explicitly to the compensation issue. And so I don't know if, I know embedded in the challenges and probably a part of the equity conversation and potentially the licensure and credential conversation will have some of these conversations. But in the same way that we call out these very specific things, we know that the real issue in early childhood education is wage and compensation. So does it make sense to really speak specifically to those issues? Because I think that it's a landmine, you know, and I just feel like we really need to have someone really thinking through all aspects of it, and that can help to inform even the conversations that are occurring in the other subcommittees.
Thank you, Georgia. Paige?
I want to piggyback on what Georgia said. I'm 2 things, and forgive me for it's not my it's not my scholarly notion that worries about words. It's my Vygotskian notion of our brains actually, you know, help us make meaning through language. So I wonder if we should add compensation to joint licensure credential, or we just call it licensure credentialing and compensation, because and Beth has her hand up, so I'm going to defer to where she would go on that. But I wonder if getting that language in there. And I also, it strikes me, and I apologize, I didn't notice this before, but I think we need to perhaps say equity-based educator preparation. Teachers for many, you know, evoke the public school, and I don't think honor family care in the same way. So I would just put that on the table too. Thank you.
I agree with Paige's comment about language around the credential. I had my hand up because I wanted to just be clear that I think we need a group that's working on pathways that make sense, because we just had listening sessions with the field and they're having a hard time making sense of how do I get to be a teacher this way, this way, this way, this way. They're having a hard time getting through the ECTC. So I just think we need to, I think that language would encompass more, and that we really need to be thinking about somehow smoothing the pathways. I mean, yes, we need to pay people, that's the core, to draw people, but we are just, I think, Paige, I think it was Uhart, and I also talked to the community colleges recently, just with the reduced number of people entering the field. We've got to work to make it appealing and make the pathway clear. So somehow, if we can get that in the task force subcommittees.
Stephen?
Thanks. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and maybe in the spirit of really being bold, we need to at least modify these to express our ultimate intent, which is to sort of shake up the system here. Because I mean, one of the things, I've been in Connecticut 9 years. I was in Massachusetts for about 15 years before at UMass, and then Old England before New England. But I, you know, in my experience in both states, that there is a lot of change that needs to occur, and compensation is ultimately interwoven with how we prepare, how we credential, how we hire, how we think and perceive about the value of educators in those groups. And Paige, you were strong in thinking about this being a birth through age 8, or even age 6 or great, whatever. but having something that was also a lot simpler to think through. I mean, when I arrived in Connecticut, I was at a meeting about early childhood licensure, and my head hurt. And I'll keep saying that. I mean, it's just, why are we making things so complicated? We need to create multiple pathways, as Commissioner Bai said. We've certainly seen great ways forward here in New Haven, working closely with the superintendent and using Recovery Act monies to train para-educators and to prepare them with licensure programs for them to enter into to be licensed in elementary and special education. We can do it, and so money is critical, and that has to be in the ask. But I think we need to also point out that we have some structural issues and systemic issues to address. This is how we want to do it, and we need to create a lot of access and multiple pathways in. So whether it crosses over everything, or at least we want to be very specific and intentional, so the group, we're in agreement that the issues that are raised already are intersecting with this, or whether we just have to create something specific that states that. I completely agree, but the intent is very important, and it has to be crystal clear, because we're going to have multiple stakeholders and readers looking at our recommendations. Thank you.
Paquita?
Hi, and looking at equity-based teacher prep, both in service and pre-service, I'm wondering if the equity will include the necessary funding to support those who might need scholarships or programs that may be, paying their teachers to attend college, professional development, even a funded professional development system for our state. So I'm just wondering and hoping that we can address those more explicitly.
Yes.
Any other thoughts or reflections that have come up around this for you? Georgia?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure, because I feel like I'm looking at the current status challenges of ECE nationally and in Connecticut. Is it, I think, and I know, Stephen, you said that you're not from the ECE world, but I'm just wondering, do we want to create a space to really just explore that, or do we feel that we have enough historical knowledge on this panel that we can use that as a framework for all of the subcommittees, rather than just, creating a separate task force to look at it? Because I think, in any conversation around the licensure and credential, we're going to have to look at the status and the challenges, just as we would compensation, just as we would the preparation and professional development. So I'm wondering, because it sounds like we may be creating, either redoing these task subcommittees or add in some subcommittees, and we have very few people to basically work with. And so does it make sense to create a framework in every subcommittee to always have the challenges nationally as a part of our lens as we are exploring these topics, rather than making it a separate subcommittee. That way we can, you know, if we have to add additional subcommittees, then we're not stretching people across different groups.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Other folks have thoughts on that?
I think part of the intent is absolutely we tried to start to do this with the grant proposal. There's a lot of history and context there that I believe we're going to be sharing as well, because there's a lot of work put into that from a wide variety of folks in Connecticut. But I like that idea to keep that context. I know that when on matters that involve change, when I've worked with the legislators here, they often want a context or some, I mean, Commissioner Bai can speak obviously to this too. What's going on in Massachusetts, what's going on in another state, where have we seen changes occur, and what happened there? So it's not always about just what's going on nationally, but how are these things being addressed politically and or through their education agencies or early childhood agencies. So I think it was an intent to have to have that as well. I don't know whether it's one subcommittee or it's just sort of overarching work. Marcia, Jessica, or Paige, I mean.
Go ahead, Paige.
I'm just trying to make sure I'm hearing, Georgia, I'm hearing you clearly, because history I think is super important, and we definitely have documents and the collective we, I think the landscape that's happening nationally, again, you know, Beth can speak to this systemically in a way that I can't, but just knowing the connections between early childhood, special education, the leveling, which addresses compensation, but also sort of career laddering or different pathways. I think it's definitely, I guess maybe could we use some of this joint time is what I'm wondering, if this is what I'm hearing, to sort of really check ourselves. Like maybe we need to bring back, like, well, what inroads are we making towards compensation, or what recommendations do we have around equity and compensation? Like, is it like a task force, you know, call in ourselves to make sure those things are happening, or maybe even a document that helps us note those things? Because I think some sort of document house course is going to be helpful. But I wonder if it's just that's where we have a generative conversation. To George's point, I'm hearing not wanting to stretch ourselves super thin, but we also need to get all of our minds on this at some point too. So I don't know if that's an option for the monthly meeting. Again, deferring to the chairs on that.
We also have Deb Adam. Deb is on the call as well, who's agreed to supply us with a lot of data. And right, Deb, she's there, which also might address some of the issues that George is raising.
Yes, I'm here, and I'm at the request of the commissioner. So I think it'd be great if the committee came up with a process, you know, for data requests, so that each member may not be reaching out to sort of like who they know, but if you need history or data or documents or whatnot, each respective agency should be able to provide that for you, but perhaps a process in which to do that.
So one of the things I'm thinking as I'm listening to the conversation is, does it make sense for us to have an overall, as Stephen suggested, an overall conversation, like a committee level conversation about where we are and what the challenges are. And then within each committee, then we make a more in-depth dive about where we are historically, where we've been historically, where we are currently, and what other states are doing, for instance, through joint licensure and credential. What other, and again, the same historical framework with compensation, the same historical framework with the equity-based approach to teaching and preparation. And so that way we all kind of know where where we are as an overall committee. And then within each committee, that committee is actually doing the deep dive within that specific subcommittee around the historical context, the present context, and what other states are doing and what other countries are doing. Because I don't think we should look just in the United States. I think there's amazing things that's happening outside of the country around early childhood education, and we can absolutely learn from different countries, the good and the bad stuff. And I know that some countries have probably better data than we would, given some of their long history of doing early care, and or even thinking about a national subsidized approach to early care and education. So I'm wondering if we can make that, make it much more targeted, that within each subcommittee that we're digging more deeply into the history, into the current situation, and then we just create a broad context to begin.
So what I'm hearing is maybe at our next task force meeting, we have a presenter or presenters that are providing some discussion around the landscape and that context that we can then have a whole group conversation around. And then once we tweak these subcommittees, we have a context as a lens for whatever the particular topic is for that subcommittee to go a little deeper. Is that, Georgia, kind of echoing?
I think so. I think so.
Okay. Paige, were you about to say?
That totally makes sense to me. I just had a little panic about when we pull the subcommittees together. I guess respectfully, I would be so grateful if we could at least get a little bit of a start going on the subcommittees, even if that just means we have 3 buckets. We have a big place for documents, and there's 3 buckets, because just even the brain power on this task force, and that's not including OEC and SDE and CERC, I feel like we can get materials in there that it might be overwhelming. I'm not expecting that we would all read those, but at least just sort of start our working data bank. Maybe we could work on that between now and then. Sorry to be so let's not waste a millisecond. But I do also want to say something, and I think this is related to what Georgia was saying, and it's definitely related to what Beth chatted a bit ago about multiple pathways, understandable and achievable. So right from the get-go, I hope that we maybe make some of our information available in not long text-heavy versions. I'm all for position papers, but I think infographics, other ways that we can represent this information that is useful to the general population, to the voters who elected officials have brought us here. I think that's also good. I hope that's one of the things that we can do, is have some at the ready, information transfer in short time, and in 2021, 2022 kind of ways.
Yeah. Could I just very quickly build on that? Georgia, you're absolutely right. I think also we'll find, it's important to capture that we might not all agree on things, right? And that's important to capture. But we're a year behind. This task force has taken forever to be established, and that wasn't the goal, to get something done in a few months and out. But that said, we're here, and that's where we're at. So we have to be very prudent with time, and also keep in mind, I'm just sort of reiterating what Paige has said, the reader. I would encourage us all to start work now. I think Brian is putting up something that supports this, let's get a platform where we can, what do you want? Ultimately, this will end up with recommendations. And what do we want? Let's start with change. It's important to have a historical context and see what's going on, but we also need to write something that's for the future. What are the structural issues? What are the systemic issues that we need to change? We need to write that down now. That doesn't need a discussion. I think you're all deeply embedded in that. And I think those are the overarching themes of where we want to head. And then in these areas, subcommittees, they go deeper into some of the specifics. But we need to get something out very soon because time's going to run away with us. And we want this task force and the recommendations to be heard and to be cogent and to be usable by our elected officials. So that would be my sort of call for prompt, efficient action, that we don't need to create a dissertation here. I think we know what the asks are and to get those in print as soon as possible.
Stephen, I'm not sure I would agree if we know what the asks are. So I think it's really
okay.
I just want to put that out there. I don't know that we have a common idea about what the asks
and
are.
I hear that. Yeah, I've certainly been part of this world, for the world of early childhood for a while. I hear that. And we will, of course, I'm not trying to oversimplify things, but we've got to have some asks at the end of it. And there has to be, I mean, compensation, equity, and how we bring people into the profession in fair ways and encouraging ways and caring ways. I think those need to be, maybe there's some things that are just very common that we do agree on. But yeah, thank you.
Karen?
Thank you. Stephen, I really appreciated your comments about being cogent and taking this opportunity with a sense of urgency around it. I think, there was significant progress made in this last legislative session around early care and education. There was an elevation of the importance, the essential role that early care and education plays in our economy and in the lives of our children. So I think I really like your comments about let's do something that's going to drive change, and that our recommendation should really point our legislators in that direction of what change is needed. And I think, sometimes we maybe assume that people know a little bit more than they really do about what the current status and challenges are of early childhood education. So I think we should really take this opportunity to call those things out as they particularly pertain to Connecticut. And that I think the other thing that I wanted to express is that I think we really need to be really clear on what our intent is. What is the intent of the recommendations? Right? Do we just want to give information, or do we want to shake things up and get some drive systemic change? So perhaps, that is a piece that we should be talking about. Yes, these are the subcommittees, but what is the end result that we really want, right? What's the impact that we want to have as we work together as a committee, and the recommendations of that we will make going forward?
I'm so conscious I'm not trying to call him out, but I don't see Merrill on the call, which I think is a loss. So I just want to name, in the sense that I want to name here the early care for Connecticut. That consortium has just been doing a lot of work, as does the Alliance. So I want to just name them as a resource to Karen's point, I think, about landscape and those things. And then I feel like someone needs to give us guidance on, I think technically we're only allowed to make recommendations, and we can put a lot of good information in there that can stir things up. But I think technically our superpower is that we can be very articulate in our recommendations to multiple audiences. But someone might need to at least give me some guardrails on that.
I don't think this is a time for guardrails, Paige. Again, we're going to be troublemakers. Let's really be troublemakers.
I'm with you, Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been on some of these task forces. I think clarity, specificity, brevity are all important guiding principles in this. And I think if we just start to create, if there's a platform where we could share ideas and get those down, we can see where the overarching themes are.
If I can, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, please, Commissioner. Yeah.
Well, if I can just say, I think another real critical piece here, which we've seen as we've tried to roll out higher ed supports.
Yeah.
As we've been trying to get all the universities to adopt NAEYC higher education accreditation status, is that with several universities, like the education accreditation trumps the early childhood accreditation, or it's like we don't have time for both, so we can only do one. And we've worked through that with most institutions and have made progress to get NAEYC back in. But I think like one of the big elephants in the room is State Department of Ed certification, and that being sort of separate from OEC certifications. And the higher ed has this high demand, more high demand for elementary education majors, not where they want that either, but then early childhood education. And, I just think we've got to somehow in this work bring those two together. And again, I talk about make it understandable and make it easy, but also somehow, and I think we've made tremendous progress, but that early childhood education and elementary education are linked and different. And so I think any part, this conversation really has to have, let me just give you an example. And this is something that I don't know how we solve, but you can be a regular education elementary teacher without having a special education endorsement. But you can't just get certified in early childhood education without a special education endorsement. And that's because, public schools mostly had 3- and 4-year-old programs for children with special needs. And then that's expanded, but the certification didn't change at all as that changed. So like, I think those conversations and those recommendations have to be there. Like, if you get the early childhood teacher credential from one of our universities in Connecticut, you can go teach public school in Massachusetts and Vermont, but you can't teach in Connecticut. Like, this is crazy, where students are investing in a 4-year degree to be a teacher, but they can't teach in a public school in Connecticut. So when I say making it clear pathways and making it understandable, I also think we need to make it logical. And I would love it if every single teacher was joint certified in special education and regular education. That would be fabulous. But the only people we require that of are early childhood teachers, if they want to teach in public schools. So I know there are philosophical reasons for that, but I think that's the kind of thing that we need to talk about if we're talking about equity. So early childhood teachers have access to teach in public schools and private schools or wherever, but right now they're sort of precluded. And we certainly don't, I know there's always concern among childcare providers and preschools that, well, then everyone will leave and go to public schools. We are seeing people leave and go to the public schools. Now that happens. And that's where the wage piece becomes so important. Like, for me, I would way rather teach in a private program, and always didn't go to the public schools. But it's not appealing anymore with the wage differential. And so the childcare programs can't compete, which brings us back to that. But I'm sorry to go on about that one item, but I mean, that's an example of the kind of thing we've just got to look at and address, where the State Department of Ed and the Office of Early Childhood meet or don't meet, and somehow keep these different credentials. But I'm not an expert in this area. I have Deb Adams to help me with that. But that one thing always sticks with me as an example. You know, how could it be that you can graduate UConn and go teach public school in Massachusetts, but you can't teach public school in Connecticut? It just seems crazy. So I'll stop there on that, but that's an example of how we have to make the system make sense.
If I may, I'd like to respond on a couple of those, because higher ed clearly plays a critical role in our work here. I think that's why we have our co-chairs from the 2 and 4 year. If the Commissioner of Education was here, as I've worked with previous commissioners, we can recommend changes. That's why I said I was a bit confused when I arrived in Connecticut, what's going on with the integrated endorsements and special ed as well. I think we need to, again, be bold to say we don't always need that, and we need different kinds of endorsements. The regulations aren't going to change overnight. It's going to take, there's already some investment in looking at that. And similarly, higher ed doesn't change overnight. We do have to adhere to our specialized professional areas, and NACE being one. The standards are clear. The new standards we need to align with in our work. So that's important work for higher ed. That's not just in early childhood, but in many areas. And that's sort of required in how we go through CAPE and national accreditation. We link ourselves to our specialized fields. But yeah, it is sometimes seen as a burden, but I just want us to be mindful that I think we do need to be making recommendations. But Paige, to your point, we also need to, there's a reality check on some of this, because changing or adding endorsements is going to take years of work. And I think it's an important piece of work. And that's what we're here for, right? And
so that could be the
times have changed, right? So here's the impetus to change. Yes, it's going to take a long time or time, but we have to do it.
I really appreciate, Beth, that you're talking about both, how does the preparation we do here impact Connecticut? What does it look like in neighboring or regional? But I think I'm just so conscious of the efforts in Connecticut, but nationally around what integrated really means. And it always hurts my heart when I have a student who wants to work with 2-year-olds. And typically, I have to say to her, like, okay, but as your advisor and an older, wiser human, I'm just going to say to you, to work with 2-year-olds really might mean 50% of a pay. Or so, like, we pathway everyone into birth to 3 as well. And yet that's super, super important work. We've had like longstanding partnerships. I mean, personally and institutionally, Georgia and Karen, like, so much respect and support and partnership in the work there. And how do we not wind up sending, I mean, like, I know UHeart sends amazing people to Women's League who wind up leaving in a few years. Like, how do we support that? And I think we also have to take on the special ed, we have to, I'm hugging Brian in here. We need to make sure that the special ed component really is being looked at, not just birth to 3, not just birth to 6, not just birth to 8, but what does it look like, birth to 12th grade. Because I do think that's a place where the system has some sharp corners.
So to move forward, I suggest that if I'm chairing the middle one, that I think touches on the points that Beth brings up, we need, Brian, but we also need the talent office where the licensure piece and certification piece is established. And that was in their original planning when we spoke with the commission at the time. So Shwana Tucker and others are, very much aware of this. We've met them, but I think we need to, in the outside committee work, bring them in as well. Brian, I don't know if you agree, but I will be sure to include in our charge in the subcommittee on teacher prep and professional development the points that the Commissioner Bryant raises.
And so, go ahead, Karen. I see your hand up.
Paige, I just wanted to say I really appreciate your comments, because that is the living crisis that I'm experiencing right now at the Women's League, that my most skilled staff that maybe started with an associate's degree, go on to get a bachelor's degree, and I support them. I give them time off from work to go to class. I financially support them in getting their next educational credential, and they're leaving. I've lost 4 teachers in this flurry right now. I'm losing teachers to Hartford Public Schools. I'm losing teachers to CREC, and even losing teacher assistants who are going to the public school system to be paraprofessionals. The common denominator in all of that is pay. And as much as I talk with my board of directors, we can't even get close as a nonprofit, right, to being competitive. So I feel like right now I am the training ground and the preparation ground for my staff to leave me. My staff that I've invested in, high quality performing staff, they're leaving me and they're going to the public schools and, CREC. And I have to support that, right? People have to go to grow. But at the same time, it puts me in a place where I'm constantly starting all over again in terms of trying to rebuild that quality, to meet those high quality standards. So I think as we talk about teacher preparation and all of that, we have to look at the compensation piece. Otherwise, we're just going to be training grounds for the public schools and the magnet schools and the charter schools. And as early education programs, we're going to constantly be trying to meet those high quality standards because of the high level of staff turnover that we're going to have. So we have to look at something around this inequity that exists in pay.
Karen, I absolutely second what you were saying. One of my roles here at CREC is to oversee the Head Start and Early Head Start program. And with Early Head Start federal performance standards, say you have to have a focus in infant and toddler development, your degree has to have that concentration. And, as Paige, you said, the advisors are counseling staff. You don't want to go in this direction. The compensation isn't there. So we can't even find employees with the correct degrees, the correct concentration. That infant toddler coursework isn't even being offered. So not only are we not able to retain staff because the pay isn't competitive with public schools, the amount of candidates doesn't exist for positions. So it's very difficult in the workforce work. We're trying to provide the childcare in order to get the workforce development going, but we can't find quality or qualified teachers.
Again, I defer to Beth on the infant toddler space, but I want to just name here there really are very few, especially beyond the associate degree, opportunities. And I know, again, having one, I also just want to make sure part of those conversations with students is how do we make sure to really be committed to the kind of work or the ways in which people want to be with children and families. There's amazing work happening in public schools, but there's also a lot of other pushes and pressures on people. And some people really want to work with young children and their families in more home-like and community-like and less systemic, institutional-like spaces. And I think that matters so much for our field and how it's defined and how it's understood. And most importantly, for the next generation of people we're helping to raise. So I hope we can hold on to that too.
I think embedded in all of these conversations is the issue of prestige as well, that is not affiliated with childcare. And I think that's based in the historical context of childcare, how childcare is seen. And so then if everything basically redounds to the pay and credentials and stuff, and so we basically say somebody gets a credential in early childhood education that's kind of a little bit worthless because you can only use it in this particular place. But if you get an education in this particular field, then you have mobility in where you can go in terms of your career. And if, again, we're saying, well, if you get this degree, you're only going to get 50% of the salary, then we are also, and even in our conversations, and I challenge my colleagues as well, in the conversations we have about even within a different structure of early care and education, we talk really very highly about pre-K education, but we really don't elevate the work, the critical work that happens between 0 to 3. And a lot of times as an ed consultant, when I go into program, I am literally trying to dismantle the structures that they've set up in the infant toddler program. And it is a challenge because, again, it just feels like the message is constant that there is no value associated with this. So I'm not even 100% sure that if we fully address the compensation issue, that we're gonna be able to dismantle the stigma around working with young children that we unintentionally or unintentionally kind of convey when we're talking about this work. I'm listening to people talk and parents when they come in and they're going into 2-year-old classrooms. I'm sure Karen, you can speak to this, and Jenny, you can speak to this. They're going into 2-year-old classrooms wanting children to learn how to read. And that's more stark in urban settings because there is this urgency around making sure that my children are ready for kindergarten. And I'm constantly saying, do you want to prepare children for kindergarten or for lifelong learning? What is it that you want? Because yeah, if you're preparing them for kindergarten, you're right. We can focus on colors and shapes and numbers, but if we want to focus on lifelong learning, we have to get back to basic around what is really wonderful about early childhood education. And it is that social and emotional learning and competency. But if that isn't what's being talked about in advocacy, in higher ed work, then it makes it even harder for us as providers on the ground to even start to make the type of changes that we're here purporting to trying to make. So I think, Deb, a couple years ago, when we were doing when we were trying to organize or putting together our training plan for our apprenticeship program, she challenged me to say, you're missing a course here. And that course is really to talk about why it is that we do what we do. And it put everything in context because, yeah, I had a whole bunch of training plan, but at the base of that course had to be why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And we chose to integrate Maslow, Maslow hierarchy of need to really talk about why licensing is important, why credential is important, and all of those things. But oftentimes we, in a lot of the conversation, we unintendedly convey to folks that there is no value in this work that we're doing, especially at the infant toddler level. And that shows up in all of the ways that the system presents itself, whether it's through the credential, whether it's through the coursework, whether it's through the pathways, whether it's through the pay. And so I think if we can basically speak to some of those things, and I'm kind of rambling, but again, it's just, as I'm listening to it, the idea of prestige that's affiliated or not affiliated with this, career has to be addressed.
For the purposes of the recording, can I just name here one thing that I didn't say about the grant? We also networked with Judy Carson and State Department of Ed, and the entire thread through work of the Commission for Working with Families and Community. Ingrid's been the chair of it. Miguel started it. Charlene's continued it. So when Brian and Stephen mentioned other people, maybe we pulled Judy into the joint licensure pieces, because the idea, one of the things we do well in early childhood, I'd like to think that, or at least that is distinctive from the other levels, is really pay attention to families and communities in a different way. And that's a competency or an integrating feature that I think is worth considering in our credential.
I have a request. The more I hear and listen to these sound thoughts about who, I mean, I'm thinking about the subcommittee that I'm chairing, but this speaks to the other two as well. I'd like us, this is an ask of Marcia and Jessica now, can we move to who are the people I should be reaching out to? I mean, is there someone in Connecticut who's written something about, you know, the alternatives to integrated endorsements in this space? I mean, are there people or in higher ed I should be reaching out to? Certainly, the connections with OEC and SDE are critical in that space. But can I ask for, you know, either people here on this committee or recommendations for names? That's where my head is at the moment. I hope that makes sense.
I agree with you, and I'm wondering, is there someone in higher ed that brings together the college universities, the community colleges, and other entities that are supporting pre-service early childhood professions, even the types of credentials and degrees and licenses that are available? Is there somebody that kind of comes together?
I mean,
bring those together?
Sorry, quickly. Yeah, I mean, but I would just, I mean, I'm still president of the state chapter for AACT, which has 13 private and public universities who are in the preparation space. Obviously, not every one of them are in early childhood preparation. I could certainly work through that and with SDE as well. But I think my ask was, are there experts? I mean, are there specific people in and around that area that we may be reaching out to? Because I know we can talk, Paige and others, we can talk about this as well. You know, who are we bringing into the committee to educate us on various things? But also who on this committee are interested in these three areas, I think is important.
So can I want to clarify if we are changing these subcommittees before folks decide where they're going, because I think the first one we decided will not be a separate subcommittee, the one that was the current child status and challenges, right? Am I capturing that correctly, that we were going to have that really as a lens that we're all thinking about the challenges of our particular subcommittee topic, right? So there wouldn't be that separate one. And that would leave the in-service, pre-service, preparation, professional development, and the joint licensure credential / pathways. Is that where Beth's comments about the clarifying the pathways, would that go in that conversation in that subcommittee with the joint OEC State Department of Ed license credential?
I didn't hear that we would, I mean, maybe I heard wrong. I didn't hear that we get rid of the first one. I think that's an important piece of work to have, which, you know, we need to have that at hand. And I think between Deb Adams and Sir and others, we have you know, that's a resource that we need to have. So I didn't hear that as much.
Well,
but maybe
I was wondering if, and Georgia, you could help clarify for me that what I was wondering is if we wanted, even though compensation is part of the thinking in all of these, did we want, instead of that first subcommittee, to have a specific group of people really thinking outside the box around models or proposals around compensation? Would that want to be a separate designation? And so, Georgia, would you want to clarify if I'm capturing your comments correctly?
I think if you listen to what Karen said, and Karen echoes the sentiment of every single early care provider in the state. None of these will mean anything other than we're going to create an easy way to have massive exodus out of the early childhood education space if we do not address compensation. I know the OEC has done a lot of work already, and there is a compensation scale that was presented to the legislature. So I know that there is already some really strong thinking about this, both for Connecticut and nationally. But I think the proposal was just for state-funded centers. And I think, again, we do not want to create a two-tier system within the early care realm. With compensation in the same way that we've created a two-tier system in an educational system amongst early childhood, K-12 and higher ed systems. So I think we need, personally, I think we need a separate committee to talk about compensation.
I want to fully support that, because when I think, we're honoring the process of even this task force coming about and thinking about the testimonies that were there. And Georgia and I were both really strong at that point and have had a lot of amazing individual conversations to understand where our bridges are, bound by hope. I think
our intense fellowship space.
Exactly. I think in the spirit of good trouble and language, to have a subcommittee that is about compensation, knowing that it's connected to the higher ed preparation. Obviously, it's connected to levels and licensure, but to have that would be really reflective of what we're trying to stir up maybe a bit, and yet offer real solutions to. I was thinking that I was hearing that entire first committee actually is the platform, is Canvas. Like, it just becomes the thing where we all work and we can all draw on presentations and documents and maybe submit to things. But like that's like our common pool. But maybe that's too complicated.
That's what I was hearing.
I hear it too, yeah. And Jessica just put something in the chat. I think we just need to be bold and say compensation. That's it. I mean, it's critical. It's so yes, and I think current challenges and status, that's sort of the preamble into recommendations, right? That sort of goes up front. I just have a question about how the joint licensure piece in number 3 and equity-based educator prep professional. When I think about licensure and certification, that's in and creating joint or integrated or not. I feel there's an overlap there that we may not need. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paige, because you're going to share that. But the multiple pathways and access seems to be critical. That's what I'm hearing. Yeah, how do we create access? How do we create different pathways? It's sort of the bookends, the compensation and the access, and in the middle is just this mush of how we license and certify. That needs to be. Am I thinking about that right? Or
I'm just trying to, yeah, I think you are thinking about that right. So I think that's how we should do it. I don't want to lose on the wage and compensation thing. Mm-hmm. The complexity, of it, because we have 75% private businesses. They set their wages, and only about 1/3 of all programs receive state funding where we have leverage. So some of the questions are like, parents can't pay $500 a week for infant toddler care, but that's what it costs to pay the staff. So I think we could have a subgroup about wages, but I just want to be realistic about how, what's our focus? Is it the state funded system? It's usually much bigger than that. But if it's not just a state funded system, then where's the leverage? Where do policies like nowhere does the state say, you manufacturers, you have to pay your people $20 an hour. The market sort of dictates that at a level, but again, so I'm trying to think about what's a wage. I think wages need to be a work group, period. But I'm just putting out there that it's easy to forget that unlike public schools, which are publicly funded with teachers' unions that negotiate wages, we have this system of 4,000 programs, 3,000 of them totally independent of the state that are no different. I mean, they're very different than a store, but they are private businesses governed by their own boards. So I think basically the charge of that committee should be to think about leverage around wages. How do we figure out what do we have to leverage to improve wages? Because, you know, that we're talking about a big societal problem, you know, to George's point about, you know, not being respected as a field. It's women's work, you know, there are many reasons. But I just think if we have a wages subcommittee, we've got to be pretty focused on what wages, where and how, and what are our leverage points, because this is the challenge for our field. It's why it's so many different things to so many different people and so many different ways that it's offered. But they are mostly just private businesses. It would sort of be like all of you saying, how are we going to deal with wages in the private schools? Just think about, we're 3/4 private schools. I think that's maybe the easiest way to think about it. So what do we have power over using the legislature and using this committee? And then from there, get the charge.
I have a quick question, but do we have a percentage of the people who took the stabilization funds and actually took the wage supplement of the stabilization fund? Would OEC have that data? What percentages of program did
we have
that?
that data, and we have good data, and I think that would be a really good thing for the group to dig in on. Like well over 90% took the funding for wages, and I expect well over 90% will sign up for the wage supplement.
Yeah. And that's our leverage, Beth.
Well, if we believe that the state should be subsidizing private businesses, 4,000 of them, that's one point of leverage. Yes.
And if we look at farms, if we look at farm subsidies, the country is doing it.
Yeah, that's a good way for the committee to look at it. Yeah, but I'm just saying we've got to think about where there's leverage. So that may be a place that you see leverage, or that the committee says, here's where we have leverage.
Yeah, I think there are lots of, again, I know that within our network, everybody took advantage of that, that subsidy, and that, you know, when we have our meetings, the new subsidy or the new wage supplement, that's always the big focus. When is that going to be available? I think Care for Kids is also another mechanism. I think Connecticut has a lot of levers, and I think it also has a lot already built in to help with that. I just think at this point it's a question of the will, is the will to do it.
Yes, I agree I think Care for Kids is a great lever to do it. The rates are way low. That's an area where that's well within the state's power to pay at a rate that allows programs to pay their teachers a living wage.
I guess I see that as the trifecta, right? It's the providers, public or private, it's the families, and it's the users. From my perspective as a preparer of educators, if like how do we get off the treadmill that Karen described, you know, so that both institutionally, but also so that people can make informed choices about where and how they want to work with young children, because they don't have to just defer to money.
I think it would be great when we look at the joint licensure and credential, like if there were this two-way pathway that educators could look at, who typically might look at just public schools, would say, oh, well, there's an option for me to work in a community-based or a faith-based early childhood education center, and I can take my talents there, right, and make an impact in the lives of young children, and I can make a comparable salary, right? So I think right now it's just like one direction. They're leaving community-based early childhood education programs and going into the public schools. I have yet to get anyone to come to me from a public school, right? Because it's just not financially feasible for them. But if we, through this joint licensure and credentialing work, we could look at how there could be this cross pathway. How great would that be for children?
And just going back to the idea of language, I think we need to talk about pathways rather than licensure, because then that opens up all the different ways that we can get people in through the system. So,
well, that's sort of where I was a moment ago. It feels like licensure is all wrapped around the sort of traditional preparation in a service pre-service, and trying to unpack that and make recommendations to refine that and give more access. Whereas pathways is inclusive of, but beyond that. That's how I'm thinking. That's what I'm hearing. So
yeah, so it opens up, the pathways open up the door for apprenticeships.
Yeah, exactly.
So
alternative ways. Yeah.
If we do keep licensure, I appreciate your simplifying, Beth, but I want to just go back to part of the initial catalyst here was to look at those two systems of OEC and SDE and say, you know, it was your letter and we got a letter who signed to say, no, we're actually going to say, we'll figure out how to put two logos on something.
Yeah,
you know, I don't want to lose the.
Well, I'd say that's more than joint licensure. Whenever I hear the word licensure, I think regulations, credentialing, standards. That's more like interagency collaboration. That's bigger. That's pathways, right? That's access. That's Connecticut moving forward versus the nuts and bolts of what's in a program that endorses early childhood. Maybe I'm not thinking about it right, Paige, but we can.
I think Paige's point is, I think, I certainly agree with Georgia about pathways is our challenge. How do we remove all these barriers so people get on the path and get toward a degree? But the reality is that SDE has licensure. So I think for the committee to have licensure in the name now would be okay, but we just have to know that the goal is to help people achieve credentials. Or, I mean, I guess we could say instead of licensure, credentials, but if we're talking about both systems, we need words from both systems at a level, I think.
Got it, thanks. And these are working groups, right? So ultimately,
they're working groups, and they can rename themselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
So are we at a point where folks can think about where they might want to land and maybe drop, I know Beth put her name in the chat. If you want to put your name in the chat and which of those three you would like to work on. And we would need a chair for the compensation subcommittee because that was just developed. So I don't know if anyone wants to throw their name into the ring there for that.
So I did volunteer to chair that committee.
Oh,
so,
cool. Okay,
and by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but Beth and I actually all solved already the compensation issue just now in our conversation. I don't know if you noticed it.
We're done.
I don't know that we came to an agreement.
Okay, I haven't been keeping up with the chat, so thank you.
No, I'm joking. I'm suggesting that, we just put more money in and care for kids and so on. and subsidize the industry, just like we do with farmers. So
Thanks, Georgia. So while you're figuring out where you want to go, put it in the chat, and Ken, you'll be able to save the chat for us to revisit, or that goes back into the minutes.
Yeah, I'll take a look at the chat and make sure it's represented in the minutes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So do we need, this is possibly a question to Ken, do we need to formally move that the subcommittees are named, chaired and tasked in work? Does that need to be minuted, or, I mean, that's
I'm gonna add it to the minutes, but it doesn't require like a formal process by the
okay.
You need to vote on it or anything.
All right, thanks, Ken.
Okay, so we have our 3 subcommittees. I know, Stephen, you had some questions about disentangling your subcommittee from Paige's subcommittee, and I think y'all can have some conversations to figure that out. Okay, so as we are, does everyone feel okay to close that part of the conversation? Okay. So the last slide, Ken, if you could just advance to the last slide, just captures our plan for our meetings for the fall. So we're going to be meeting on the second Wednesday of the month, 10 to 12 on Zoom. These are the dates. We will be inviting guest presenters, and Marcia and I will take into consideration what was raised today, particularly about like having folks come who could provide that historical and contextual information. So if you have people that you would like to come and share and present, please feel free to drop their name in the chat or email Marcia or myself, and we will do some of the coordinating to bring people in. And we were thinking subcommittees, giving some subcommittees time to do some work and time to take into consideration the presentations. So subcommittees would report out at the November and December task force meetings. And we wanted to also give an opportunity for public comment at the November meeting. If folks, providers, educators, family members, community members want to give us some information to consider as we move towards the final report, which will be put together in January. Any questions about the work plan? Marcia, anything you want to add that I might have missed?
No.
I suppose the only thing I would add is it might be, and I'm happy to provide some examples, is what we're sort of looking for, what's the end product, and back to some of the principles I was saying before of clarity and brevity. I don't think we have time to produce 100 pages of reports, right? But we want to be very clear, or at least point to data that exists that people who need to go in deeper can access. But I suppose I would call for policy recommendations, white paper versus, just to set the mindset, right, that we're not producing a long report, but we really want to produce very actionable items and actions to change and move.
Great.
I'm not trying to get out of work here and say,
no, that makes
you're
sense.
going to get.
We want this to end up in policy, right? So.
Right. Yeah.
So concretely before September 14th, is it, this is what I'm hearing, tell me if I'm being too speedy. I'm hearing that we're going to have some sort of platform where we can put some things and start that virtual space. And I'm going to name these and then please tell me which parts I'm supposed to help with. And then I'm assuming sooner than later, we're going to get a list as chairs of who's on our committees so that we could at least maybe get an initial conversation before September 14th, we're just sort of off of this for the committees and maybe get, because I'm not in a panic, but especially if we have public comment by November, it means we have some lean in here. So at least from my perspective, I'd be grateful to get the subcommittee together at least once before the 14th, so that we're sort of we keep having traction. Pardon if that seems too urgent, but.
Well, I'd like to question the timeline. I suppose, again, that's back to our education clerk here. Is that really the timeline, given that the we're reporting this back to the education committee and the legislative session begins, I don't know when, next year. But do we need, it does seem really tight to have to ask for public comment by November versus having a little bit more time. But am I missing something here? Because I feel that the second question I have also, which might be back to Ken, can I bring members from outside this committee for work on the subcommittee, or is it just members of the subcommittee? Because I certainly have people in mind that I'll be reaching out to, but they're not here. They're in higher ed.
Yeah, so as it relates to the deadline, I'd say that we try to stick. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, you're a bit faint. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. But we want to stick to the statutory deadline. So we do kind of want to look at having the report prepared by the middle of January. So, it's timely in that it be prepared at that time because the legislature would be getting the session at that time. And as it relates to your second point, yes, you can invite any members that you like to join you on the subcommittee discussion.
Okay, thank you.
That's going to be very helpful.
Thank you.
So just want to clarify, so we can have folks that's not a part of this task force be a part of the subcommittee to guide the work, Ken?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
But then can we also clarify, I appreciate we need a report by mid-January. I'm so about transparency, but I have to say, feeling like we have 2 meetings before public comment when our 2 years or 18 months has been taken to 4, I'd like to respectfully suggest that we don't open to public comment, especially if we're bringing people into subcommittee and we do our work, and the public comment can be in the January space. If that feels cloak and daggery, let me know. But
no, I second that page wholeheartedly.
Like, whew.
No, wholeheartedly. There has to be a respect on both sides because of how long this committee took to be established. That we need our time to do a good work, and respect that the public will have a report that's for feedback in a timely manner.
Yeah, I defer obviously to you, Jessica and Marcia, but that just feels like if we can, especially given I think these are all recorded and posted and all the minutes and everything, and we would welcome anyone to join a subcommittee, or be part of it. That feels like we should at least have 4 months to do our work.
That makes sense to me, Paige. Marcia, does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Does that sound okay to everybody else? Okay. All right, so I didn't check the chat, but if you didn't decide on a subcommittee, you can email. And again, if you have people in mind that you would like to present at one of our whole group task force meetings, please send us in an email as well. And Marcia and I will be in touch via email with the members with information on where documents are going to be. Ken's going to help with that. and as well as information about who our guests will be at the next meeting. Marcia and I are coordinating that. So I think I can make a motion to adjourn unless there are any other closing comments that people want to say before we end.
We have to thank you so much for chairing, and Marcia too. Thank you so much for bringing us together in thoughtful ways.
Agreed. Excellent job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
We're gonna debrief. We got a different.
Yeah, I sent a
different-
separate, I sent a
Okay.